And, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to engage in a colloquy with my Republican colleagues.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're here today to vote in really, I think, half an hour on the overriding the President's veto of congressional action that would not have allowed us, the country, to move forward with the rule that's the so-called waters of the United States. Now, Mr. President, waters of the United States sounds like a lot until you look at the map beside me. This is a map of my state, the state of Missouri, of what would be covered under EPA jurisdiction if this rule was allowed to go into effect. This map from the Missouri Farm Bureau is a map that nobody has taken issue with, and only the red part of our state would be covered by federal government authority. Only the 99.7% of the state that's shown here in red would suddenly be under the jurisdiction of the EPA on all things related to water. Water running off a parking lot, water running off your driveway, water running off your roof, water falling in your yard, water falling on a vacant lot if someone wants to build a house on that vacant lot. Those things in 99.7% of the state. I think that 0.3% may be some kind of unusual seepage area where the water runs away in a way that the EPA hasn't yet figured out to assert jurisdiction over. But the law passed in the early 1970s, the Clean Water Act, Mr. President, said that the EPA would have jurisdiction over navigable waters. So if you believe the EPA and believe this rule and believe in the President's veto, navigable waters would apparently be every drop of water in 99.7% of Missouri. If the President and the administration, the EPA, want to change the law where it no longer says navigable waters, but where it says virtually all the water, there's a way to do that. You introduce a bill, you come to the Congress votes on that bill. If the House and Senate approves it, I know this sounds like it's a pretty pedestrian discussion, but apparently the President and the EPA don't understand that that's the way to change the law, not just somebody decides that all of the water in Missouri, or to be accurate, 99.7% of the water in our state, of the geography of our state, on any water issue, suddenly becomes the jurisdiction of the EPA. I will assure you that if the EPA gets this jurisdiction, there's no way that they can do what they say they think the Environmental Protection Agency should do. That's the case in Missouri. I'm joined by my colleagues from North Dakota and from Wyoming to talk about this, and certainly we have been on the floor repeatedly to talk about this. We've also talked about remedies. The great remedy here would be any regulation that has significant economic impact should be voted on by the Congress. It's a bill that we've all co-sponsored called the REINS Act. Now, the analogy here is pretty good to put the reins on government, but what really would happen in the REINS Act is anybody who would vote for a rule like this would have to go home and explain it. Frankly, I think anybody who doesn't vote to override the President's veto had better be prepared to go home and explain it. And Senator Barrasso, Senator Hoeven have been vigorously in this fight. And Senator Hoeven, I know this is something that matters where you live, where we live, but it's also a great indication of what happens when the government somehow just believes, no matter what the Constitution says or the law says, that the all-knowing federal government should be in charge of everything, everywhere. In this case, virtually all the water of the country, Senator.
Well, that's absolutely right. Pleased to join my distinguished colleague from the state of Missouri, as well as a colleague from the state of Wyoming and our colleague from the state of Iowa. This is an incredibly important issue. It's probably the #1 regulatory relief that all business sectors need. I mean, starting with our farmers and ranchers, this is a huge issue, the energy industry, but across all sectors, because this is a big-time overreach by the EPA, and it really affects all property rights. So you're talking about private property rights that are at stake here. And there's a fundamental principle at stake in terms of how our government works as well. The EPA has taken, through its own regulatory fiat, additional authority that it does not legally possess, and it's done so under a legal theory that it's advanced called significant nexus, and essentially has gone beyond the jurisdiction it has, which is regulation in regard to navigable bodies of water, like the Missouri River, for example, to, in essence, say it can now regulate all water wherever it finds it, anywhere. Now think about that. If part of the executive branch or a regulatory agency can unilaterally say, you know what, we're not just going to operate under our legislated authority, we're just going to take additional authority that we don't legally have in order to do what we think is our job, then we've got a fundamental problem, because that defies the underlying concepts of the checks and balances in our government, where the legislative, judicial, and executive all offset each other in order to protect private property rights. And that's absolutely what's at stake here. And essentially now, the EPA has stepped into a role where they can regulate water anywhere, in any capacity. So if a farmer, after a rainstorm, goes out and wants to move water in a ditch, or even an individual private property owner wants to do that, do they have to apply to the EPA for a permit? How do they know? Who do they go to? Are they going to get consistent rulings? And why in the world should they be subject to an agency without legislative authority just deciding that they're going to have jurisdiction or authority in cases where they don't have? So it's a very important principle in terms of protecting private property rights, as well as the fundamental fact that has such a devastating impact on farmers and ranchers and really every sector of our society. And so I would turn back to my colleague from Missouri and ask him to touch on maybe just a minute what we can do about it. We're here on this floor today to have a vote. And I think we need to point out how important it is that our colleagues join us in making sure that we override this presidential veto.
Well, I appreciate that. And, you know, this is a bill that's been on the president's desk. It passed the Senate, which means that 60 senators were supportive of this rule not being able to go forward in its current status. The president vetoed the bill. This would be the time for the Congress to stand up, and if you didn't have any other interest in this fight, the time for the Congress to stand up and say, if you're going to change the law, the only way to change the law is for the Congress to change the law. The president appears to be willing to discover all sorts of ways that can't be found in the Constitution to change the law. But even if you were on the other side of this issue, even if you'd want to come to the floor of the Senate and vigorously argue that the EPA needs the jurisdiction of all the water in over all the water in the country, as a member of the Senate should do that. The House should do that. The Constitution should work. And Senator Barrasso, it's clearly not working here. Navigable waters was used in federal law since about 1846, and until the last couple of years, when the EPA asserted differently, everybody always thought they knew what that meant. You could move something on it, you could navigate it, which of course the Constitution says the federal government has an obligation for interstate commerce. And so debating how much of the Missouri River, as Senator Hoeven brought up, is navigable is a constitutional debate to have, because it's a commerce issue. But suggesting that all the water in the country, Senator Barrasso, is navigable doesn't make sense. And you've been one of the leaders in trying to point out for months and years now that this rule will be ruinous to economic activity.
Well, Mr. President, I just want to agree and second everything that my colleague from Missouri, Senator Blunt, has had to say. That map of Missouri, 99.7% of his state underwater, according to the EPA. We had a hearing, and I looked at a map of Wyoming that the EPA presented. It looked like the entire state of Wyoming was underwater, according to the EPA. This is an incredible overreach on the part of this administration, this EPA, and it's so interesting because the President of the United States always says, if you have better ideas, bring them. If you have better ideas, bring them. Well, we did. A number of us co-sponsored legislation, bipartisan. We had a number of Democrats supported it as well, to allow for Congress to establish the principles of what a new EPA rule would look like. Didn't say get rid of the whole thing. It said there are ways to make it better. Ways to make it better. Let people on the ground make those decisions. Who are the best stewards of the land? I mean, here we are. The presiding officer, former governor of South Dakota, knows that the people of his state have much better love of the land of South Dakota, just like the former governor of North Dakota, who's on the floor, knows the people on the ground there in North Dakota, much greater love of the land and respect for the land and desire to protect the land and the water and keep the water clean, just as we do in Wyoming, just as we do in Missouri. That's what this is about. It's about letting people who have the best interest, the best stewards of the land, make those decisions, not, again, a federal grab that is absolutely absurd. And it shows a president of the United States who is acting in a way that I believe is lawless, to the point that the courts have now weighed in. The courts have begun to weigh in on the concerns with this rule that we're going to vote on today, and we hope we override the veto of the president. Because the courts have said, hey, we need to take a pause. Judge Erickson of the District of North Dakota, August 27th, issued an injunction that blocked the Waters of the U.S. rule in 13 states because he said the rulemaking record was, listen to this, inexplicable, arbitrary, devoid of a reasoned process. Devoid of a reasoned process. Yet the president saying, oh, no, they got it all right. The president is wrong. The United States Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals put a nationwide stay on the rule in October. The court stated in granting the stay, they said the sheer breadth of the ripple effects caused by the rule's definitional changes, they say, counsel strongly in favor of maintaining the status quo for the time being, yet the President of the United States ignores it all. Congress needs to have a say, the courts are having a say, and the President needs to realize that his actions have huge impact, negative impact on the economies of our states, our communities, and certainly of the entire country. So it's a privilege to be here to join my colleagues from South Dakota, North Dakota, Missouri, and soon from a colleague from Iowa who will weigh in, supporting the effort to override the President of the United States on this specific piece of legislation.
And, Mr. President, we're urging our colleagues to do just exactly that, vote to override, reassert the constitutional authority of the Congress, and to finish up our part of our discussion here this morning, somebody who also understands the importance of the land, what it means to love and appreciate the land, how you can do that closer to the land than you can further away, the senator from Iowa, Senator Ernst.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
Yes, I want to thank my colleagues today for their colloquy, the senators from Missouri, from North Dakota, and from Wyoming. This is a big deal, not just for those of us from these states, but for all Americans. We have a choice today. We do have a choice. We can stand with our farmers, with our ranchers, our small businessmen, our manufacturers, our home builders, or we can stand with an overreaching federal agency that is committed to expanding its reach to over 97% of our land in Iowa. As my colleague from Missouri stated, 99.7% of the land in Missouri. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to stand with my constituents. I'm going to stand with Iowans who have told me time and time again that their voices weren't heard in this process and that their livelihoods are being threatened. Instead of listening to those that will be most impacted by this rule, the EPA thought it would be better to use taxpayer dollars to illegally solicit comments in an effort to falsely justify their power grab. And a little over a week ago, President Obama in his State of the Union address pledged a willingness to work with Congress on cutting red tape. And this bipartisan legislation presented a great opportunity to do just that. But instead, he sided with unelected bureaucrats and an unchecked federal agency. So apparently, he must have already forgotten what he had said. I would also like to remind everyone that in November, 11 of my Democratic colleagues voted to uphold President Obama's rule at the behest of liberal special interests. And then immediately, they ran for cover by sending a letter warning the EPA they may oppose the rule in the future if it isn't fixed. Only in Washington could someone reserve the right to do their job at a later time. And now here we are 3 months later, and this rule isn't fixed. Well, I say to those colleagues, today is that later time. Join me and help fix this rule today. In closing, we all want clean water. That is not disputable. I have continuously emphasized that the water we drink needs to be clean and safe. However, this rule is not about clean water. It is a regulatory power grab that harms our farmers, our ranchers, small businesses, manufacturers, and home builders. Stand up for them today, not a federal agency gone wrong. I urge all my colleagues to vote to scrap this ill-conceived Waters of the United States expansion. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.